Hello there, and welcome back to the Film Score Podcast. My first interview for this season is with Amelia Warner. Amelia's latest score is for the Disney biopic The Young Woman in the Sea, which is about Trudy Ederle, the first woman to swim the English Channel. And so Amelia's score balances both sports triumph and obstacles, as well as familial bonds and struggles in the climate of the early 1900s. So Amelia and I spent a lot of time talking about that score, what it's like working with legendary producer Jerry Bruckheimer, and plenty more. And of course, we branch out as well, including talking about one of Amelia's earlier scores, which is for the film Mary Shelley. And I do want to say, in the interview, I mentioned Mary Shelley's book, The Last Man, and I think I errantly call it the first pandemic novel or the first post-apocalyptic novel. It's actually often cited as the first modern post-apocalyptic pandemic novel. It's a mouthful, but want to make sure that's accurate. Now you can find out more about Amelia by going to her website, looking on social media. Amelia, thank you so much for joining me today. How have you been?
I'm good. Yeah, I've been well, thank you. How about you?
I'm doing all right. I wish I could match that high energy level you have, but it's 9 a.m. on a Monday morning for me, so maybe I'll get there in a couple days.
Yeah, maybe when you get to like 3 o'clock on the Monday, like me.
That, or I'll be ready to just take a nap.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
It's coincidental timing for this interview actually because I watched Mansfield Park like a
Oh my
month ago or
God.
so, and in the credits I saw your name, and I was like,
I know.
"Wait, what?"
It's like a blink in
Yes.
the moment. I think I was meant to play like the teenage version of her. And then I think when we kind of got there on the day, it was really clear that we didn't look very alike. And so it was like, it was meant to be, it was never like a big part, but it was meant to be a little bit bigger. And yeah, I think it was like, oh, yeah, they don't look at all alike. So it ended up being like one shot and out.
Maybe the back of your head or something. I was
Yeah,
I
I
was
think
trying to
they do
figure
use
out
the
when
back
that
of my
even
head.
came through.
Yeah, I think they did use the back of my head actually.
I'm sure it's something that you talked about before, but it's a really interesting switch because you don't, I mean, off the top of my head, other than maybe like Charlie Chaplin and Clint Eastwood, you don't see very many actors or actresses starting in acting and then having any movement into like, composing for film, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, can I just say, like, probably
Sure.
the first time I've ever been put in a group with Charlie Chaplin and Clint Eastwood, and I'm loving that. That's
That's not,
really
it isn't bad
great,
company, right?
great company. Yeah, yeah, it is unusual, I think, and yeah, and it's in some ways they're not connected at all, and it feels like really like vastly kind of different kind of vocation. But then I suppose it did give me a great grounding in understanding kind of character and story, and I guess approaching a script from that place of an actor, which is probably how I still read scripts, to be honest.
Hmm.
Very much reading it as from the character's perspective and the emotional journey, rather than reading it kind of thinking necessarily all about sound or music. So I think that it's probably been quite. I don't know if it's been helpful or not, but I think it probably just means that I approach things slightly differently, because of originally being in that area of a filmmaking process. And I think also like being on set, I was on set a lot, and I think that gave me a really great, again, understanding and kind of
Hmm.
context for a script and for what everybody's doing and what their job is and what their I kind of was a real observer, and I used to just watch a lot and really take note of the heads of departments and the director and the DOP, and kind of listen into those conversations. And really that was the side of acting that was fascinating to me, was kind of being a fly on the wall and watching these amazing filmmakers and the decisions they were making and the conversations they were having. So I think bringing all of that forward makes it a lot easier for me to now be in those kinds of discussions
Hmm.
and to understand where people are coming from and what journey they've been on up to the point that I come on board right at the end after they've been shooting and pre-production, and I kind of come into it with a lot more context in a way.
Interesting. And one other person that falls into your trio that came to mind, Viggo Mortensen as well. So,
Oh yes, of course, yeah, great.
but it's really interesting you say that, because I think a lot of film composers, like you said, they're coming in the last 6, 8, 10 weeks,
Yeah.
and very rarely have that opportunity to really be seeing the script in advance or being on set and seeing how things are. And so that does sound like an extra benefit for you, even if you're not on set now when you're working on a film, but having that understanding or that experience already, so you can kind of approach the things or understand things from perhaps a different angle than if you were solely coming in with just the music experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think it probably has some kind of part to play in my process, but it's hard to know how much.
Sure, because that's always
The only
been
way I know,
part of it,
exactly.
whether consciously or subconsciously. Yeah, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And so one thing that I found interesting about the young woman in the sea is that it feels like maybe a bigger scope than some of the other projects you'd worked on before, particularly with like the musical elements, adding action suspense in it as well. And so was that like a conscious challenge for you, or did it present an additional challenge to face or to overcome?
I think that those challenges kind of presented themselves as I became active on the job. And I think that probably when I came onto the project, wasn't as aware that it would be that kind of score. I think I thought that it would be more like melodic and kind of,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I was thinking of it in one way, but then once I started seeing footage and once they started putting it together and the first cut and the director's cut, it became apparent that actually there's a lot more kind of action that needs to be scored alongside all the emotional stuff. And because swimming, it's a tough one, and it's like, how do you make swimming really exciting, and how do you give the film like a propulsion? And I think that was the thing that it really needed, was how do we kind of create this propulsion and keep everything moving forward, and have this, how do we make swimming kind of visceral, and how do you show the strength in a swimmer, because it's not like other sports when you can kind of see everything. It's harder to really see what someone's doing. And I think also very early on there was a conversation with Jerry Bruckheimer where he was like, this is a sports film, that's what this is. And I'm not sure I had really understood that until he said it, and until I saw that cut, and I suddenly, the brief just changed, and it was like, oh wow, yeah, this is a sports movie. And then it was about kind of going back and revisiting some of those brilliant sports movies, from the past, and working out what the music was doing, what the score was doing, and I guess trying to emulate that in some way, because I think the film really does hark back to a kind of old-fashioned experience. But it's like, how do you create that classic old-fashioned sports movie, but have it feel contemporary and have it feel exciting and relevant to like today's audience? So that was, yeah, a big challenge, but really fun to figure out as well. But probably something that slightly took me off guard.
Mm.
And so the kind of percussion and the electronic side of it was really not what I was expecting to be writing, but was so happy and thrilled that that's the direction that it took.
That's a point that I wanted to touch on as well, talking about making it feel contemporary, adding electronic elements, but it's also a film that takes place in the 1910s, the 1920s, and so there's also obviously a very near history, historic period aspect to it as well. And then, of course, there's diegetic music used throughout the film too, that's period specific. And so, how do you strike that balance of something that does feel contemporary without it being so modern or contemporary that it clashes with the film's obvious setting?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think the film could take that kind of music on board much more than any of us
Hmm.
anticipated. So once we started to kind of push those boundaries, and then actually, I have to say temp was really useful in this way, because often it was the temp that was kind of showing us this is working, the film can handle it. And so it allowed me to push those boundaries as well. And I think if we'd have kept it within the constraints of the 1920s, it just would have, I just don't think it would have done Trudy justice. Like, I feel like she was living ahead of her time. Like, she was dynamic and brave and unusual. And to have something period and potentially feeling quite limited and like I say, constrained, just wouldn't have been right to tell her story, which was really about pushing boundaries. You know, there was a balance, and like you say, it wasn't full, like a fully electronic score. You know, there's a big orchestral element, but it was just about trying to marry those two things and try and make it feel relevant. And I think the percussion was just such a big part of that, and keeping that in a traditional orchestral percussion palette just wouldn't have, I just don't think it would have done the job.
That does make sense. And this is going to feel like a bit of a non sequitur, but I promise it's only temporary. So talking about doing Trudy justice and her being ahead of her time, it does remind me kind of thematically of Mary Shelley, the 2017-2018 film you worked on. You know, obviously Mary Shelley known for Frankenstein, kind of like the first sci-fi novel, I suppose. And I also realized she did another novel, and I can't remember the name, but it's basically like the first like post-apocalyptic novel as well. And so again, like very thematic similarities. But I was wondering, like, did that come into play at all or ever kind of cross your mind while you were working on those?
Do you know what? It didn't. But now that you bring it up, yeah, there's a lot of similarities in the women themselves, and I suppose in the way that I approached scoring those films. And actually, with Mary Shelley, it was a similar thing where, to be honest, the temp was a real friend to me, because the temp was, the editor was being quite bold with the temp. And I think that paved the way for then me to be really bold with the score. Whereas I think if I had just started sending in loads of electronic pads and atmosphere and kind of weird things, the filmmakers might have been a bit jarred by it. But because there had been some kind of more avant-garde stuff thrown in there, it meant that, you know, because temp can be such a funny thing, and in some ways it can be a real hinder, but actually I'd say with Mary Shelley, it was a real help, because it kind of just demonstrated that we could go outside of the boundaries of maybe what they were expecting. And again, with Mary Shelley, you know, Mary Shelley was a gothic film, and for me, that was the main thing that I always thought about. And it was kind of like, well, what's gothic now? You know, and I know that we hear a lot of old horror movies, or we have this kind of gothic sound, which I wanted to use. And I used soprano and I used lots of voice and some of those traditional elements. But then it was like, but now we've got all these other things we can add into the mix and kind of subvert it. And so that's what I wanted to do with Mary Shelley, was create a kind of modern gothic soundscape, I suppose.
It's really interesting that you're talking about all these ways that temp is helpful, because I think quite often you hear, particularly when it's like non-composers talking about temp music and their understanding of it, it's always like, oh, temp it's ruining music for film and TV. And I'm sure, like, not I'm sure, there are certainly instances of that where it perpetuates a constant or standard sound, but here, like, multiple examples of where it's useful or helpful. And so for you, kind of, where is that line drawn between when temp can be helpful to you as the composer and when it can be a hindrance?
I think it's a really difficult dance, and I've had both. You know, like I say, I've found it to be really helpful as a way of demonstrating things, and a shortcut in a way to, you know, sometimes those conversations can be difficult and long, and sometimes temp can just do the job and explain something in a really quick, direct way. But, you know, I've also had instances where it's been impossible to replace, and people have been really in love with the piece and really unwilling to, I guess, explore something different. And I think that can be really frustrating, because also people live with the temp for a really long time. So it becomes almost like enmeshed with the film. And then when you come on and you see it with fresh eyes or fresh ears, and you want to try something completely different, there's just very little space for that often, because people have just got so used to the temp. And sometimes, again, that can work in your favor, because you put something new on and it's like, you know, it kind of reinvigorates a scene and it's really exciting. But also often that doesn't happen, and there's like it can just close people's minds a little bit, I think. And it's hard when, you know, you watch a film and it's temped with just, you know, there's certain music that sits on there that your heart just sinks, because you go, oh God, this is just going to be impossible to replace, especially when something's working really well and you're like, yeah, that works brilliantly. And it's intimidating sometimes, you know, when there's an incredible piece on there and then you're competing with it with something that's samples, that's not real yet, that's not recorded. You know, the music they're using is recorded with an amazing orchestra, you know, and then you're trying to compete with your demos. So it's really hard. And sometimes, you know, they're like, oh, it's just not moving. It's not moving me in the same way. You're like, because it's a sample violin and that's a real one. And these are pretend instruments and there's no expression and they're not being played by amazing musicians. So, and I think sometimes explaining that and expecting people to understand that it's tough, you know, it's really hard.
So I've actually never thought about that, where it isn't like you're taking what would be basically the final cue, the final version of it, and being like, okay, this is what we should use. But yeah, I mean, it's two vastly different, I guess, versions of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a leap of faith. You know, you're asking them to take a leap of faith sometimes, because you're like, I know that this doesn't sound like that. I know, you know, but I promise you when we record it, it will have that quality, it will have that emotion, it will have that expression, or whatever it is that it's lacking. And I know that, but they don't. So it's really hard sometimes to get things over the line.
So in, let's call it, and you know, my words, not yours, in like the worst case scenario where you can't push them off the temp, no matter what you're doing, it isn't working, how are you then approaching scoring so that it isn't just, here's the closest we can get without getting sued?
Yeah. I think often, you know, like lots of things in life, usually what I end up doing is, if that's happening and if I'm kind of doing something in a similar vibe and trying to emulate ideas that's in the temp, and if it's just not working or as effective as the temp, I usually just actually do something really different and kind of go, okay, look, we've kind of come to the end of the road with this. So I'll kind of approach it and just think, right, what else might work? What could we try that is going to feel different? And often it's kind of the opposite, or, you know, it's something really radically quite different to what's been on there. And then that usually works. And it doesn't normally work as in it ends up in the film, but it gets you away from the temp. And then often you end up back in a place that's quite similar to the temp, but people haven't heard the temp for a couple of months. So you just got to get it out, you know what I mean? And sometimes you just have a placeholder. So you just have something that kind of works, people don't hate it, and it's, you know, and you get it in and you get the temp out, and then often you can get somewhere interesting again. But that's sometimes you just have to get something in place of the temp.
So that's the advice to all the younger composers: put in something that people just don't hate.
Yeah, just get the temp out, and then you can come back, and then you can, you know, people forget and they get used to your weird cue that you managed to get in there that you don't even like, but it's kind of it got in. So then you're like, right, let's revisit this cue, and you're getting a much fairer hearing, I think, at that stage.
That makes sense. I love it. So going back, talking about kind of maybe let's say the earlier days of working on this, you had mentioned at one point you kind of had to switch the approach of the brief changed. Before that happened, how were you approaching the score, and what maybe genre-wise or stylistically were you trying to do with it?
So I think the initial conversations, we were thinking something really classic, sweeping, traditional, thematic, you know, lots of themes. I remember kind of Cider House Rules was a big reference. What else? I was listening a lot to Shine, that amazing score. And, you know, there are a few things, but it was, you know, quite kind of piano, strings. I remember in an early meeting, it was like no horns, no brass. That's not right for this film. I was like, okay. And then it ended up being the biggest brass section that I've ever been lucky enough to record. So yeah, that was the place that we were coming from initially. And then very quickly, once I came on in earnest and started working on it, it just completely changed direction. And I think that the sports film aspect of it became much more important. And also, it was really interesting because I remember, I think this was Jerry who said this, but it was really interesting because I think I was writing this very like beautiful, quite ethereal, watery music, thinking of the ocean and this. And Jerry was like, she's an athlete and this is a sports film. And I think it was like challenging my own conditioning in a way of going, why am I writing this kind of very beautiful music? Because she's a woman, because it's, Daisy Ridley and she's beautiful. And, why am I doing this? Like, if this was a man, what music would I be writing? And I think that really changed my mindset because I realized that actually where did that come from? Where did that idea come from that it had to be beautiful? And so I think that, again, that was a real gear change when it was like, right, let's focus on what she's actually doing and the power and the strength and the athleticism that it takes to swim the channel, and what music can we find that's going to reflect that.
It's interesting because if instead you were writing the score for, and no offense to Stephen Graham, but Stephen Graham's character, William Burgess, who had the second man to swim the channel, no chance that you're going to be writing like an ethereal theme for him.
Totally, exactly. Yeah.
But it's now like trying to think about it, because what you end up having in there, the main theme is very much you could say a sports theme, but I think it transcends that into just something that's a bit more inspiring, triumphant, even in the darker moments. I mean, the story, what's going to happen. Like it's there pushing you as the audience, Daisy's character as well, Trudy, like really adding that triumphant propulsion, we could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you had mentioned a minute ago, or a couple minutes ago, about your initial approach was going to be more thematic, but there still are like a number of themes and motifs used throughout. So what was your initial thought process regarding how to use themes, and then how did that change as the process went on?
Yeah, I mean there are lots of themes, and I think everybody wanted the film to have a strong main theme, and it was really nice being able to write in that way, because personally that's the way that I love to write music. Is I like melody, I like writing melody. I find it really hard to not write melody. So it was like a dream to be told, like, we really want strong melody and we want the music to tell the story. We want the music to be a tool that we use. And I suppose having those themes was a big part of that, because it was having her theme and having that payoff at the end when she does do the final swim. You've kind of done the work, you've done the groundwork. You've had that theme from the very first time you kind of see her face. So it felt like a really fulfilling way to write, I suppose. But I think, again, when we started, we all thought, great, we've got the theme. This is great, we're done. And that wasn't the case at all. And there was one point where we ended up with just the theme was everywhere. And we were like, oh my God, we have to pull this right back and kind of go back and be a bit more academic about it, actually, and really look and see, okay, where do we really need it, and save it for those moments. Because there are so many triumphs and there are so many despairing moments that, it was like, how do we, I guess, save it and make it, keep its potency? Like, I wanted it to still feel potent at the end, because like you say, we know the story, people can look it up. It's not a secret, but you still want the audience to think she's not going to make it. So I think that there ended up being a lot more themes than we anticipated. And I think that the one that became really essential was her, we call it the race. It's like her kind of race theme, and it's maybe tapping in again to the more athletic, punchy side of her. And then the main theme became really about her and her family and her and her sister, and that kind of main theme was about her and Meg and about their relationship. And actually that's the person that she sees at the end, and that's the relationship that to me gave the film so much heart. I just really loved their relationship and their closeness, and I really bought into it. And so I think that the theme ultimately was about them, rather than it just being like Trudy's heroic theme. Yeah, I'm trying to think what we had a theme that was trying to, I guess, represent her more fun, carefree. We called it free spirit. It was like the fun, childlike Trudy, out of the water, because she was fun, and she was a free spirit. You know, she lived in her own way and on her own terms. And I think in that time, for someone to live like that, it was really hard and really unusual. And you have to be very strong to do that. And I think also the family love that she had around her, you know, that real close family, was what allowed her to be who she ended up being, because she had so much love around her.
Now, what was the process of pulling those more subtle aspects into like the thematic material? Because I think you could very much approach like her main theme as, here's her triumphant theme, and it's going to be in a orchestrated or arranged in a different way, or like put in a minor key when things aren't going well, but you know she's going to get over it, and like much more surface level, where here you're pulling in familial ties and her sisterly connection, things like that into it too.
Yeah, I think that if we'd have just had a kind of heroic theme that was just triumph over adversity and here we go, she's gonna do it, I just think that we would have lost some of the heart. And I feel like we were all really focused, and it was really important to us that that heart was there and that that love was felt. You know, the love between her and her sister, and the love between her and her mother and her father, was just really important. And I think that that's what's moving about it. That's why it's so moving at the end. It's not because she swam the channel necessarily. It's because of her sister being there on the beach waiting for her and thinking that she's lost, and it's her mother and the radio station listening to what's happening, and it's her father. It's all of those elements are what make that. I feel like the film is so emotional. And like I said, it's not because, oh wow, she swam 21 miles. Like, it's not that. It's all the stuff going on around her, and the support and the belief and the hope that they're holding on to. And that's what gives the film heart and what makes it so incredibly emotional to watch, I think. So I feel like the themes had to reflect that.
And I don't know how it was for other people. That was definitely the same for me. There were quite a few moments. I mean, there's both like in these kind of mini peaks and broader peaks throughout, but even just like the familial adversity or bonds that
Yeah,
they really do affect you as the viewer, as the listener. But at the
yeah.
same time, I think it could also have been easy to have pushed that too far, where it's like the movie and your score are very much just, I guess, overtly or obviously twisting those heartstrings and opening those tear ducts. And so, was there a point while you were scoring where you were like, ooh, this is too much, we have to pull this back and restrain a little bit?
Yes, I think there were definitely points that I felt that I had to do that. It's a really hard line, you know, it's really difficult when you're making a film. And the thing about Young Women in the Sea is there's not like a cynical bone in the film's body. Like,
Yeah.
it's so truthful, and it is what it says it is. It's not being clever. It's not that it's not being clever, but it's not cynical. Like, it really is just telling a story, and it's a family film, you know. So I kept going back to films that I grew up with, you know, like White Fang or A League of Their Own, or all these kind of really heartfelt, honest films. And the scores do take you on a journey, and they do twist you, and you know, they do manipulate, and they do. But it's, if you're kind of okay with that, then there's something quite lovely about being taken on this journey and kind of handing yourself over to the film and just going, right, I'm just in, and I'm gonna follow this story, and I'm going to go on the journey that the filmmakers are taking me on. And I think that that's something that is maybe more rare now as an
Mm.
audience. I think maybe it still exists in animation, you know, where you get there and you just go, right, I'm handing myself over to you, and I'm going to cry when you tell me to, and I'm going to laugh when you tell me to, and I'm going to love it. Watching films when I grew, you know, in the 90s, films were more like that. You know, you went and you just handed yourself over to the experience. I think it's just a bit more unusual. So I think that in some ways I had to fight a lot of instincts with Young Women in the Sea
Mm.
to actually just trust the process and go, this is emotional, so I'm going to write emotion. This is sad, I'm going to make it sad. This is, instead of trying to be too clever. And I think that, again, Jerry, it's something that he kept talking about, is that let the music tell the story. He's like, let the music do it.
Mm.
And that's so rare to be really given that opportunity, because I think we're always so afraid of going too far, being too kind of syrupy, being too sweet, telling people what to think, telling people how to feel, which is always my instinct, is like, oh God, that's a bit on the nose, or that's too. But this was a real experiment and a joy in going, no, just tell the story and let the music tell the story. Once I got into that, then I just loved it. And I was totally on board to be really just like, telling a story through the score and letting the score really hit those beats and really lean into those moments and let the music kind of soar when it needed to soar and let it go small and fragile when it needed to, and not really overthink it in a way. But then there's always that fear of turning it, you don't want to go into kind of a Lifetime movie, so there is that balance, and it's not, you're definitely crossing that line, pulling it back, it's a constantly moving target, so it was changing a lot. And there's probably people involved who think that it was too much, and there's probably people who didn't think it was enough. It was something we all talked about a lot, put it that way.
And that's one of those things that, of course, there's never going to be, not to say that there isn't a right level, but there's never going to be a level that everyone agrees on. And I'm sure at some point you just have to go, this is what it is. Jerry Bruckheimer likes it. The director likes it. Like, that's good enough for me.
Exactly. And I think that's what you do ultimately have to do that. And then, it's almost not really even up to you by the end, because it's, as long as it's the people in charge feel like it's working, you have to kind of go, right, then I'm happy.
I do like the amount of times you've mentioned how positive the experience or the feedback was from Jerry, because I think as the viewer or someone that's following film, you can often get the belief that maybe producers or like studio executives are watering things down a little bit, making things sound a little homogenous instead, and it sounds like this was sort of the opposite, where he's telling you, keep going, keep going.
Absolutely. And I think Jerry Bruckheimer he has such I don't want to say brand, because it's not the right word, but what a Jerry Bruckheimer film is,
Mm-hmm.
He has his aesthetic and his way of telling stories, and it's not watered down at all. And he's so involved, and he was involved in every single cue.
Oh, wow.
There was nothing that he wasn't massively involved in. And again, that, I was just so amazed by that, because he cared so much. And I think getting to kind of listen to him talk and the way that he approaches things and what he's thinking about, which is only the audience. That's, Jerry, he cares about the audience and what they're feeling and their experience. I think approaching it from that perspective was just really quite liberating. And I really just enjoyed flipping it and not thinking about me and what I think the music should be, and what, it was, no, how is this going to make people feel? Is it pulling the lever they need? Is it doing the thing that we need at this moment? Is it creating the atmosphere that we need? Is it telling the story? Is it selling the character? Is it, and it was just such a different approach. And, I think if you look at his films, like there's just the most incredible scores. And I think his favorite part of the filmmaking process is music. So he's so knowledgeable, and he just knows exactly what he wants, and he's so clear, which again was just such an amazing way of working, because at times it's quite hard, but you are getting like instant feedback from him and very clear direction, and he responds really emotionally to things. So I found it really refreshing and, like I say, liberating way of writing music, when you've got that instant feedback of somebody saying, yeah, that doesn't make me feel anything, and that made me feel something. And it was a great barometer, and there's no ambiguity.
That's great. That's great to hear. So, Amelia, we've got a couple minutes left. There is one thing that I've been curious about for quite a while. So I think this was maybe around when Wild Mountain Time came out. I had been then listening to some of your other stuff, and I'd seen that you'd won the Breakthrough Composer of the Year from the IFMCA back in 2018. And then I saw that there was a weird reaction among some people that was very hostile towards that. And I was wondering, how do you handle that sort of thing and kind of get it so that it doesn't bring you down or bother you and just like keep going?
Well, to be honest, like I probably wasn't very aware of that.
Good,
So
good.
thanks for bringing it to my attention.
Oh, great.
Um, I mean, I'm not, I think in some ways because I came from a completely different background and because I've really been very isolated as a composer. Like I
Hmm.
don't have composer friends. I didn't go to music school. I didn't assist people. I didn't all the ways that you normally get to kind of be around the community. And I think the first time I ever really met other composers was when I was nominated for something at the World Soundtrack Awards.
Hmm.
So I've come to it from a really strange place, as in, sometimes at my recording sessions, it's really difficult for me because I didn't ever attend a recording session until it was my own. So I'm still learning so much on every job. But in a way, I was completely out of the community, out of the.
Hmm.
So I have no idea what people would be saying, what their reaction was, and all that kind of stuff. I probably now have made some friends and I'm a bit more involved in the community and have connections and people that I see. And I'm probably a bit more in the gang now, but I definitely wasn't, and so it felt strange to me as well because there was just so much that I didn't know. And I was having to do everything for the first time in front of people, so it was quite hard. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's hard. Like we touched on at the beginning, it's not a path that other people have taken. So I suppose it's difficult for people to kind of really know what to think of me at the beginning. It's like, what is this? Who is she? Where's she
Hmm.
come from? What's she doing? I have like massive imposter syndrome and, feel like I'm making it all up as I go along, and I am to an extent, and I am an imposter because I didn't come, I have come from a completely different angle, and I suppose as time's gone on and as I've done more work and as I've got more kind of positive reaction to the work, I'm becoming more comfortable with that and actually just seeing it as, look, this is just how it's been for me, and this is just my journey. Whereas in the past, I think I felt really inferior, and
Hmm.
it really affected my confidence. I'm getting to a place now where I'm like, yeah, it's okay. And there's loads of stuff I don't know. And there's loads of stuff that I'm still learning. And there's loads of stuff that I don't really understand. And I know I can write music. And so fundamentally, I think as time, goes on, I'm in a place where I can be a bit more just kind of own that stuff. And everybody's got a different story.
And conversely, it seems like even in the film scoring world, everyone has imposter syndrome. Someone that had worked with Hans Zimmer was telling me that every time he goes to start a new score, the first thing that comes into his mind is, do I have any themes left in me? Can I still do this? And then
Yeah.
it works. So if someone like him's having that go through his head, I mean,
Yeah.
what are you gonna do?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's all part of it. And I suppose that, I think people come round, well, they don't, but that's okay as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, for a young woman in the sea, I think candidly the work speaks for itself anyways, so don't worry
Thank
about
you.
it.
Thanks.
All right, well, Amelia, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm glad we were able to wrap before a rush of kids ran
Yes,
through the room.
you too. That's good. It's good for you. You don't have to witness that.
Well, I have
um,
I in the room next to me I have three foster kittens, so I'm getting used to that madness on a much tinier scale.
yes. So cute though.
Yes, too much so. But thank you again. Like I said, I really enjoyed the score. Have been enjoying kind of hearing everything you've been doing since Mary Shelley, and so always looking forward to the next thing that you write and release.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's really, really lovely to hear.